I'm Gloria Palmer, the Executive Director of Green Mountain Academy for Lifelong Learning. And I want to thank you all for being here in this room in the library, and for those of you joining us online via live stream. I have just a few announcements before I introduce our guest speaker. Our next talk is on Tuesday, March 21st, and that is titled A Powerful Legacy, Artwork by the Women Artists in the Collection of the Southern Vermont Arts Center. That will be here in the library at 5:30. The Art Center's Executive Director, Ann Corso, will take us on an artistic journey through the eyes of women artists whose work is included in the collection at SVAC. Particular focus will be on the painter Marion Hughes, who directed Springfield Art School in Massachusetts from the 1920s to the 40s and supervised the Western Vermont chapter of the Works Progress Administration. She'll also talk about photographer Clara Siprel, who was known for her portraiture of famous figures such as Eleanor Roosevelt, Pearl S. Buck, and Robert Frost. And her work was the first by a woman artist to be acquired for the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And then there's Alfred Abbey, a Cornell University-trained architect whose sculptures, wood prints, and book illustrations are included in the collections of the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the National Gallery of Art. We hope you'll join us for this program. Please silence your cell phones. And during Q&A, we will have a microphone come around. So if you have a question, just raise your hand and wait for that. And for those of you online, please type your questions in the chat feature, and Liz will monitor that. I would like to thank the Manchester Community Library for welcoming us here in this space, and a thank you to GNAT-TV for running the live stream feature and videotaping the program. And a special thanks to the Manchester Historical Society for partnering us on this program and many others throughout the past few years. Collaboration, in my opinion, is important because it brings something to the table from each of us, and it enhances the experience for everyone. So we could not do this program, however, without mentioning Hildene. Hildene is home to one of the Pullman cars and is a part of the greater story of the Pullman Company. I hope you all have visited Hildene and have had a chance to stop in at the restored 1903 wooden Pullman Palace car named Sunbeam. And if you have not, Hildene is a true treasure in our community and worth a visit, so go. Our guest is an architect and train lover who has been studying, writing about, and lecturing on the history of America's railroads for over 30 years. He is also working on a model railroad based on the Bennington and Rutland subdivision of the Rutland Railroad in his home. He is joined by Sean Harrington, curator of the Manchester Historical Society, for moral support. Please give a warm welcome to Bill Badger. Thank you.
Thank you. About 30-some years ago, I did a program on Pullman at the request of Hildene, and there were a lot of high school kids there. And they had no idea. They thought Pullman was some sort of heart condition. And shortly after that, my mother was at Equinox Terrace, and I gave the same program over there. And I asked a different question. I said, is there anyone in the room who has not ridden on a Pullman? And one hand went up, a younger woman who was there to see her mother. Otherwise, everybody else not only knew what they were, but had ridden on them. Pullman was a household word and a huge business in the United States 100 years ago. George Mortimer Pullman was born in 1831, which is kind of a sort of a watershed year. It was the end of the canal era and the beginning of the railroad era. He was born in Western Vermont and, Western New York, and his father worked on the Erie Canal. And he was a carpenter, but what he'd done is developed a machine to raise buildings, because every time they widened the canal, they had to move the buildings back. And George learned that and went on to follow his father, but then he moved to Chicago because Chicago had been built in a floodplain and there were no sewers. and every time they had high water, everything got wet. So he was hired to raise the buildings 4 to 6 feet. They put a sewer in the old street level and backfilled over it, and now they were out of the floodplain and they had a working sewer. And he was famous for raising the Tremont House, which apparently was like a 5 or 6 story hotel. And you see pictures of it. There are these hundreds of guys with screw cranks underneath it, jacking this thing up. So he was the Mike Connors of his day, but he realized the business was ending because new buildings were being built at the right altitude, so it was nowhere to go. So he caught gold fever. He went to California, to Colorado, played with gold for a bit, and did a service thing for miners, and said, no, this isn't for me. So he came back to Chicago, and following at least one terrible overnight trip, and we'll go for a minute, 1830 or so, the railroads were just coming here, and let's say they were crude. What worked for carrying coal wasn't necessarily ideal for passengers. So the first railroad cars were really modified stagecoaches, and it was that technology that went to the railroads. It still was less than ideal. Canal boats tended to tie up for the night. If you go across New York State, you see on the thruway about every 10 miles there's a town of some sort. That was how far you went on the canal for a day, and you spent the night. But trains would go all night. Stagecoaches wouldn't go overnight. So you had this immediate issue of what do you do at night? And sitting up in a coach was less than ideal back then. So in the late 1830s, a sleeping car was invented. Now, of course, the artist's rendition makes it look like it's 20 feet wide. In actuality, it was about 8 feet wide, but it had permanent bunks. The linen was kept at the end of the car, and the chance of you getting clean linen was about zilch. They were having trouble getting guys to take their boots off because you just slept in your clothes, and it was not suitable for women and children. And this is what Pullman kind of observed and said, there's got to be a better way. The issue was there were no dining cars. You stopped. Here's 10 minutes for refreshments. You get off the train, run in, grab something, and run back out again. Not leisurely. This is White River Junction. No danger of getting left. Gongs ring. Conductor announces departure of all trains. There had to be a better way. One particular railroad that he was familiar with was the Chicago and Alton, running south out of Chicago. And this is a little bit later, because you see down here it says Pullman Palace Buffet sleeping cars and Palace dining cars. Pullman had gotten to them, and they'd given him 2 old coaches to renovate. And he did. Here's the stove. Here were the seats. And the upper berths folded down so that you would make the seats into beds. They had curtains down the aisle. It was an improvement over what had been around before. I believe this is the same car. It's sort of low. It's not luxurious, but it was a far cry above what was there. And Pullman was convinced it was. And he told the railroad he was going to make it and have it run. And he wanted an extra fare for it. Well, the extra fare for the regular sleeping cars was $1.50. The extra fare Pullman wanted was $2, and the railroad said, that's stupid, nobody's going to pay it. The only people that complained were the ones who couldn't get into the Pullman car because it was that much better. That's Pioneer, 1865. This, he said, I can do better. So he built this car from the ground up, completely new, and it did what he wanted it to do. Give you an idea, inside, this was the little smoking area, men's restroom, seats up, bunk fold, upper berth folded down, lower seats put together, and here's the curtain pulled and this is the ladies' washroom at the other end of the car. This was, you know, an improvement. The only catch was it was too big. Wouldn't clear stations and stuff, and so the railroads wouldn't touch it. However, when Abraham Lincoln died, Mary Todd Lincoln had already seen the car and said, I want that in the funeral train. So the railroads got their saws out, trimmed back their platforms, the station overhangs, and suddenly Pioneer set the norm for, and other railroads said, well, if they can do it, I guess we're going to have to do it. So that kind of established that a bigger car would fit, and they went on from there. I'm just fascinated by a lot of black and white pictures, which unfortunately don't show other than what's there. This is 1880, a few years later. It's starting to get a lot of ornamentation in it, but still the same basic concept. Now they're getting fancier, but this was the hotel car. He tried making a hotel car for a while, which also had eating and cooking accommodations. So here are the tables. This looks like some sort of buffet thing down here. He realized it didn't work all combined all in one car, and it would have to be separate dining cars. He played with it for a while and said, let's let the railroads deal with that. So he gave over the dining car operation to railroads. Now, a sleeping car was for night travel, day or night. But what about trains that didn't run it, were only a day train? So in 1875, he came up with the idea of a parlor car. Now notice these seats are not, the second part of the car has regular seats, but this thing looks like captain's chairs. Fancy pivot chairs, again, an extra fare, first class. It's just a picture that shows up everywhere of Pullman pointing out one of the features. What he's pointing to is a paper wheel. And you say, what? It was actually sandwiched between two pieces of steel. But the idea was to reduce vibration and make for a more pleasant ride. And they stayed with those into the 20th century. But I have a feeling water eventually would get in, and water and paper don't mix so well. This picture gives a bit of an idea, although I question the color. I think the color is wrong, but that's only me. Coming out of the Pullman plant, gilded, very, very fancy cars. Now, part of the deal was that it was the equipment, but it was also the service. And Pullman early on realized that if he provided first-class service, he had to provide the people that would do it. So in kind of there are lots of different sides to it, but he realized that if he hired former slaves, he got people that knew how to serve, were willing to work for not much money, and they got good tips, which made these jobs not bad. It's sort of opening up the middle class for African Americans, but so much was dependent on tips. So the more obsequious they were, the better tip they got, which sort of prompted this whole, scraping and bowing and encouraging not the nicest work environment. And there was constant racism. But the Pullman porters were, one leg of his business, and they became famous. And it gave many freed African Americans from the South the opportunity to tour the country, to see what other people were doing, see how the rest of the world lived. And it's often said it prompted the Great Migration, where vast numbers came north to Detroit, New York, Chicago, get out of the South. Well, they knew that was there because porters had come back and said, hey, you won't believe what's up there, let's get out of here. Another car, and again, only in black and white you can see the gilding. It's Pullman's Palace Drawing Room and Sleeping Car. Well, what's a drawing room? If you didn't want to be mixed in with the crowd, if you're family traveling together, so you get a private room. In the private room at daytime, it was a couch and a chair. Otherwise, it folded down. It could be a bed at night, but you weren't in with the rest of the crowd. As the century goes on, towards the end, the cars are getting fancier. Look at all the stuff on the roof here. This is how, for those who haven't experienced it, how the Pullman works. Here's the seat set up. There's a folding table, like every bus or whatever we've all been on. And then here there's a metal bar across, and these back seats will go in the middle to make a continuous bed across. When the upper berth is up, all the linens are in the berth. When it folds down, you've got the linens for the upper and lower. They're right there. They're not somewhere else in the car. And then the curtains separate everything to give privacy. And a few illustrations of the day, what it was like, you know, riding in the car, and at night. So at night, on this side, the curtains are down, they folded up the lower berth, upper berth, sort of still behind the curtains, and this side hasn't been done yet. Look at the inlay work here. And we're starting to get patterned upholstery. The Pullman car was always high style of the day. So you had to watch it that this might have been in style in 1890, but in 1898, it was old-fashioned. So they were taken in, totally gutted, remodeled, or sold off.
Wow.
It's black and white photos don't do justice. So this may even be Hildean's car, but I went through looking to just give an idea of the colors and the opulence in these cars. This one has me a little bit confused because these wheels, this is called a transfer table. And you roll a car out of a shop that might be doing upholstery, put it on the transfer table, move it down, roll it into another one that might do the gilding. That's how you move them around. This car's a little too long for the transfer table. I have no idea what it is. More pictures. I could look at these pictures all day and looking at just the decorative work, the gas lamps. Now, for daytime traffic, we look quickly at a parlor car. A normal parlor car, and this, if the first parlor car was 1875, this is 1876. They were immediately popular, and you know this is a lot nicer than the city in a straight day coach. And the other side of that was the pretty much only men in the smoking car, you know, spittoon on the floor, feet on the furniture. And I've heard from railroad guys that smoking cars just stunk. They were just awful. A little later, drawing of a parlor car and beverage service. You know. And an idea of the parlor cars, sort of various. Now this one has, we'll come back to this. This one has wicker furniture. Remember that. And a variety of 3 cars, just, they had so many different accommodations. This thing has sort of seats in the middle. This one has tables. This has some big captain's chairs. And how they work, this is a little bit later car, 1937, but this was a 24-seat parlor car. And here are the 24 seats. There's a men's room, and it says down here smoking, so it's men's smoking room down here. A boiler buffet. They serve light food on these cars. This was from Boston to Montreal on the Rutland Railroad. Down here is the one drawing room, women's room, and that's the car. Anyone who guesses it's Manchester is right. There's the Pullman porter standing out next to his car. It's winter, snow on the ground, you put all their clothes. And Sean and I have been going back and forth a little bit with this, is when it was. It's a day train, so the porter would have been for the parlor car. There's no sleepers on the Green Mountain Flyer, the day train.
You can see the skis.
Oh yeah, skis down here.
Oh, yeah.
I believe the parlor cars came off in 1942 because of the war effort. So that would put this late 30s, early 40s. That's how we try to guess photographs. What can we tell about them? This is another one that had me mystified for a while. The only line running Pullman sleeping cars, Manchester to Chicago. Why would you go Manchester to Chicago? Summer traffic. You know, the summer people coming from Chicago to Manchester. Without change. This is someone wrote 1875 there. Central Vermont Railroad, rates always lower than any other route. The Central Vermont had leased the Rutland at that point, so that's the reason it's Central Vermont. But I was thinking, well, how would you get to Chicago? Well, you go down to Troy and take the train west, right? Nope, that's New York Central. New York Central didn't run Pullman cars. That was a Wagner car line. So how do you get there? Central Vermont always had relationships with the Grand Trunk, and Manchester is about here, so you would come up through Rutland to Montreal and then out the Grand Trunk to Chicago. It took me a while to figure that one out, but this. Now Pullman had a number of different factories. They'd bought other car companies because they had various factories scattered around. So George Pullman decided to build the ultimate company town. And this is not a coal town down in Pennsylvania or something like that. This was all architect designed houses, landscape design. It was spectacular. That doesn't look like a factory. That looks like, you know, and it was fine. The rents were high. Pullman had this idea, I guess typical of the 19th century, this wasn't just for his workers. This was to run as a profit. So the rents had to cover the cost of everything. He had investors. In the financial crisis of 1893 hurt Pullman fairly badly. The orders were off for cars. The people weren't traveling as much. So they weren't making money. So Pullman reduced wages, made them work longer hours, but didn't reduce the rent. And I read somewhere that typically on payday, you'd get two checks. One was for the rent, one was for the extras, food and lodging, food and clothing. And as soon as you got both checks, the Pullman rent collector was behind you, tap you on the shoulder, you signed the rent check over. So they might get a total check of, say, $9.07. $9 was the rent, 7 cents was for food. So they were really unhappy. And they went on strike. Eugene Debs came in as a labor organizer, and Pullman went on strike. And it was a big deal because it's not just the Pullman Company, it's the Pullman operated the trains, and other unions throughout the country, mostly in the West and Midwest, refused to move a train with a Pullman car in it. So passenger traffic kind of came to a stop. The governor of Illinois refused to do anything. I think he was more sympathetic to the workers. However, there was enough complaining that President Grover Cleveland stepped in because the passenger trains carried the mail. So this was a federal issue. Federal troops were called. Let's see if I think this is federal troops lined up.
Wow.
And
Gee, gosh.
so there were some deaths. The troops came in. It was a mess, and the strike ended, not in the workers' favor. However, it so shattered George Pullman that he was a wreck. I mean, this was his dream and everything, and it had just been nasty. He died 3 years later, and the family was so concerned that his workers would dig him up and do nasty things to his body. He's buried under 10 feet of concrete and steel. And in comes Robert Todd Lincoln. Actually, Lincoln took over before Pullman died, but he was general counsel for Pullman, and he took over as president. In his years, Pullman made a number of significant changes and gains. In 1900, Pullman bought their last competitor, which was the Wagner Palace Car Company. And Wagner had been a Vanderbilt, under the Vanderbilt umbrella. So there was the New York Central running Vanderbilt cars. The whole idea that Pullman was having is you could get on a Pullman car and change railroads, but not have to leave your car. Whereas if you went by coach, every time you changed railroads, you had to get on a different car. There was even a scheme in the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, to build a railroad up along the edge of British Columbia into Alaska, out to the end of land to the Bering Strait. I don't know whether they would probably ferry cars across, pick up a branch to the Trans-Siberian, and you would be able to take a Pullman car from New York City to Paris. Now, the fact that the Russian railroads were 5-foot gauge and everything else was 4 foot and 8.5, I'm not sure they've quite figured that out yet. And how you get across the Bering Sea, I don't know. But it was a scheme, and I think a short section of it was actually built in British Columbia. But between World War I, the Russian Revolution, and it never came to. But that was the way they were thinking. Is you can, this is universal, and that was what Pullman was striving for, is get on a Pullman and go anywhere. So once he had bought Wagner, now Wagner's president was William Seward Webb of Shelburne Farms, who was married to a Vanderbilt. So that was the Vanderbilt connection. And this is Shelburne Station. Webb looked at Shelburne Station, the old one, and said, that's not suitable for my guests. So he had his architect design a new station for Shelburne. It was his station, the railroad didn't own it. And this building, you say, that looks like Shelburne Farms. That was for the family's private cars to be undercover when they were at home, before they went. His wife had a car and he had a car. I said before, styles change. This was in a book on Pullman, I think promoted by Pullman, 1917, and it says the latest Pullman parlor car in simplicity of modern car decoration. And you're looking at it, go, what happened to all the inlay and the beautiful wood? This was 1917. This was the style. And if you had run one of those 1890 cars, people say it's old-fashioned. I don't want to ride in that. This was nothing about nostalgia. This was the latest and greatest out there. Pullman reached its peak in the 1920s. At that point, it was the largest hotel chain in the world with 26 million guests a year, and every one of them woke up in a different place they went to sleep. And you go, how the logistics of that was mind-boggling. Most first-class railroads had an exclusively Pullman train. This was the 20th Century Limited, the New York Central. Again, like the Pullman cars, the train was modernized every few years, so by 1939, it didn't look like the 1900 version. Santa Fe's Super Chief, Illinois Central, either one of several, City of New Orleans, or there's another one they had, but most of the railroads had an exclusive train that was no coaches, only Pullman cars. And that was first class. But and even in England, the original Pullman cars in England were US built, shipped over, and run over there. The Pullman is still, the name is still used in England. And just so you don't get the idea that it was only Pullmans running entire trains, this is Rutland Railroad's Mount Royal, train 51 at Rouse's Point in 1939, July 1939. And fortunately, the photographer kind of made some notes on what he had there. The last three cars are Pullman cars. Then there's a coach, there's a baggage car, and then there's an assortment of other cars, one of which I think was the well-known fish car. For years, they had a Canadian National refrigerator car that was known as the fish car, probably because of the aroma around it. But this car, the third one down, was a broiler buffet parlor car. It's an overnight train, but there was no diner, so this provided the food service. The middle car here is the New York City car, and the last one's the Boston car. And I guessed it right away because there's no air conditioning and all the windows are open. It must have been, and you're still behind steam. So it was hot and dirty. Oh, going back for a second, this reminded me of something else. The lanterns on the back. I don't know if anyone has ever made note of the Johnsonville Tower. If you kind of go the back way over to Mechanicsville, there's an abandoned switch tower, this brick building sitting up beside the highway. That was for the Troy line and the Mechanicville line combined there, and that was where the switchman went. Well, in the glory days of the Rutland and the overnight train, when the Mount Royal rolled through Johnsonville at 1 o'clock in the morning or something, the number of lanterns on the back was the number of taxis needed in North Bennington, usually for college girls, for Bennington College. So the towermen would see the number of lanterns, telegraph to the North Bennington station, say, have 3 taxis waiting or 2 taxis waiting or something like that. And so they'd wake up the taxi guys and get them out rather than having extra cars or not enough cars. It was, somebody thought that through. That was service. This is another collection, another picture in the Manchester collection that we don't know anything about. A bunch of guys on the roof of a Pullman car. It's a Manchester photographer, and there's a little, you can't see it, I can now just see there's a little arrow here that whoever did it was circling somebody. Is it a salesman's convention going somewhere? We don't know. They wouldn't have thrown a ladder up to a car just sitting in front of the station because this train would have moved. So it's probably, it was sitting on the side track in the station waiting to be loaded, probably with these guys, going somewhere. And the 20th Century Limited New York Central's train was the last all Pullman train, and when Penn Central took it over when they were merged, they stuck coaches on it, and it was the end of an era. Now notice though the observation car on the end. We'll come back. Talk briefly about the cars. The first cars were open platform. You went up the steps, went in the car, and stayed in the car. You were not allowed to go between cars while the train was moving. You'd fall off. Can you imagine going out there at night, snowing, raining? Guys would just disappear. You know, find the body or find some guy staggering to the station later and just fell off the train. So you didn't leave the train. But once they started to get to dining cars and bar cars, you had to move about the train. So Pullman developed a narrow vestibule, which was an enclosed vestibule. At the end of the cars, there was a canvas, spring-loaded canvas connection between them, and these little bifold doors. You went up the stairs, you went through. When the train was moving, they were closed, you could go through. But it was kind of it didn't last long. It wasn't the best deal going. So shortly thereafter, in the mid-90s, 1890s, they came up with a full enclosed vestibule. And you open the door, latch the door, push a little pedal on the floor, this piece of steel flops up out of the way, and the stairs are open. And when the train leaves, the conductor goes in, puts the floor down, leans out, everything's good, close the door, you're good to go. And that's Amtrak, everything now, that's what they did. Another type of car they were building was the open platform observation car. The rear of the train, a fancy train, might have an observation car. And you could sit out there. This is a parlor car section of it. You could sit out there in chairs and watch the world go by. It's a great place to sit. And here's a famous publicity painting done by the New York Central Railroad. The Centuries, that's the 20th Century Limited's passing the eastbound, passing the westbound, somewhere in the middle of the night. And this is the rear end conductor is just, trainmen always watch each other's train. So they were going by, every patron, we hope, maybe there's some guy here, gone to bed, and he's just watching a train. But you get the idea, the back of a fast-moving train, an open platform car, is probably pretty dusty, dirty, and you wouldn't want to be out there in winter, so they eventually faded away. But in their glory, they were great. And inside, here's the parlor section of one of them, looking out onto the platform. This is another one looking forward into the train, parlor car. Here's looking back again. And you can probably date this. The car was named the Jenny Lind, so anyone who knows when Jenny Lind was popular can probably figure the decor. Back to some cars I just think are spectacular. And look at the inlay work on here.
Yeah. Boy, fancy, huh?
Mm-hmm. The price was too. No, that's
And again, I think this is Hildean's car, but just to give you an idea of what the black and white pictures are missing. Now we're at the end of the wooden car era. 1907, the outside is simpler, it's not all gilded. And the reason it's the end of here's another 1907 car, Jamestown. It was the first steel car. Why steel? The Pennsylvania tunnels outlawed wooden cars. Because if you had an accident in a tunnel with a wooden train of wooden cars in a fire, it would be a mess. If you had one under the Hudson, you could damage the tunnel with a roaring fire. So that's it. And all the railroads, the New Haven Railroad had a huge fleet of wooden cars. They were scrambling fast to make steel cars. So you're getting steel, same year. This is slightly later, but it's kind of interesting. No air conditioning, so they're pre-cooling. I think that's full of ice and a fan. And they're blowing cold air into the car. But also, look at the side. People didn't change easily. There was hesitation about a steel car. So there's fake wood paneling on the sides. This is kind of the typical heavyweight sleeper. And they had a lot of them. Like, at their peak, 9,800 of these cars. And they were kind of like erector sets. You could bring them in, you could change the windows, grind the rivets out, redo the rivets, change what's underneath. So you could change it from one type of car to another type of car. That's what they did. This one was rebuilt in the 20s, but you see the lumps on the roof? That's air conditioning ducts. And there's even more junk underneath them, because now you had to put the air conditioning compressors and everything hung underneath them. And this happens to be the same car. And this is 1920s style. And you say, well, wait a minute, oops. Too many buttons. But it's got wood. No. They tried painting them plain colors, and the public hated them. So that's all painted wood graining. It's steel. They said the amount of wood in one of these cars weighed about 80 tons. The amount of wood you could carry in a wheelbarrow. It's all steel and all painted to look like something other than steel. And again, a preserved car somewhere, just to give you an idea, a color idea of what we're used to colors. The people that can colorize photos now would have a field day with this. But another standard steel car, air conditioning. This is probably an open section car with a, open beds and not compartments because you can see right through it. And here's the interior of similar class car. Again, painted wood, faux wood.
Fancy, huh?
And then everything was keeping up with the styles. You see the broken scroll pediment? Okay, we're in the colonial revival period. The lamps here, this is whatever the latest architectural style was, Pullman was following with the same thing. This I found fascinating. The car name is Havana. So I'm assuming this was on the Florida East Coast, New York to Florida East Coast Railroad that went out to Key West. The whole idea, look at the decor. The idea was you started your vacation in Manhattan at Penn Station. And you see the photographer standing there. But they decorated the cars for the run they were on. And it wasn't just, a standard Southwest jet that looked like anything. I suspect this car's Crystal Springs was in the Southwest. There's sort of a Spanish look to it. So I'm guessing Southern Pacific, Santa Fe, one of the Southwest lines. As the 30s went on, some of the streamlined cars were coming in, so they were taking some of the old heavyweight cars. I mean, these were six-wheel trucks, 80-ton beasts. By the way, part of the 80 tons, they were built like battleships. They had a concrete floor in them. They wanted, and if you walk into one, you walked in, when the doors close, it's just like, it's quiet. And that was the idea. It was quiet, smooth riding. So they were streamlining the outside just by painting and making it look like a more modern car than it was. It's probably the same vintage, Art Deco, a far cry from the old decorative chandeliers. And then the whole car construction shifted to lightweight, streamlined cars in the late 30s. And if those look funny to you, there was less and less interest in open section cars, where you just draw the curtains. But as people wanted more privacy, so they went to various different drawing rooms, roomettes, and I believe these are roomettes, and these are little windows for the upper berths. But someone has carried, Amtrak still has roomettes. My wife and I took the train out to Portland, Oregon. We had roomettes in Chicago. Someone described them as a sleeping closet, and that's pretty much what they are. During the Second World War, we needed a lot of sleepers for moving troops around. There weren't enough, so Pullman made troop sleepers. They're basically a boxcar with better trucks on them, and they had berths in them, and they had kitchen cars for the troop trains. I can't believe, when the war was over, these things all went to railroads to become baggage cars and stuff because nobody wanted to ride in. And another big business was private cars. This is Hildean's Sunbeam. Before private jets, people had private cars, private railroad cars. And if you could afford it, you had a private car, or you could lease one or rent one from the pool if they had a series of cars. And I mentioned before that Webb had his own cars. His wife had her cars. Lincoln never had his own car. And I'm sure he just called down to the Poole shops and said, hey, I'm going to Manchester next week, and give me the newest car you got. And we have no pictures of a private car parked at Manchester. I can't believe he just got off. I would think they put the car, but we have no pictures of it. So whatever he did, he didn't have his own car, but he took something from the Poole. Another one of interest is Grand Isle. Grand Isle is actually a Wagner car, and I believe it was Ellesmere. Just to make things confusing, William Seward Webb named all his cars Ellesmere. So that makes them a little difficult to track. And he'd get a new one, the old one would get renamed, it would go somewhere else, and I think one of them became Pilgrim for a while, and he would have a new Ellesmere. But I believe this is one of his Ellesmeres, and then it became a Rutland Railroad business car, because he was president of Rutland. Then I think he gave it to the president of Central Vermont as their business car, and it was finally retired and given to Shelburne in the mid-50s. But if you go in, the interior is beautiful, 1890s. But the outside is steel sheathing and painted up in 1950s Central Vermont scheme. And the first time I saw it, I said, what's going on here? Well, they had no idea. They looked at me like, deer eyes in the headlight. Well, what are you talking about? So I had to go back and talk to some train fans. They said, oh yeah, in the 50s, they jacked it up, they put a steel underframe under it, and they sheathed it with metal plates screwed onto the wood. Yeah, it's a wood car underneath there, but the inside and the outside don't quite match. Another one, which I was trying to keep this so I could get you home for breakfast at least. The Gertrude Emma at the Conway Scenic Railroad is a beautifully restored open observation car, and I think you can still ride in it. There's extra fare. And Dwight Smith found it up in Maine on the Bangor and Aroostook. He found two old wooden railroad business cars, not in very good shape. So he bought them both and discovered that the Gertrude Emma, which is actually his wife's name, he renamed it for her, was the observation car for the Pennsylvania Railroad's Pennsylvania Limited of 1899. And it was called the Yellow Kid because of a fancy paint scheme with yellow window stripes on it. It was gorgeous. Everything was painted gray, battleship gray. So they took a couple of years and paint remover, cleaned up the inside, painted it back to the Pennsylvania Yellow Kid color scheme, and it's beautifully restored. Another sort of type of car is the railroad business car. Railroads have and still do have business cars, and this is not a private car as in somebody's private jet. This is more like a business jet. This is for executives to go out on the line to look at stuff. They still have open platforms because you're probably not going fast. They want to look at what's around them. It works for the railroad. There's a Pennsylvania car. There's a Georgia Railroad car. And now I'll go back for a second to say and my area of expertise is not labor, civil rights, any of these, but it's part of the Pullman story. So if I get myself in trouble, tell me later. The sleeping car porters, underpaid, overworked, had been trying for years to get a union. They weren't allowed in any other unions because they were African American. So starting around the turn of the century, they were making some efforts. Pullman was trying to block it as best they could. And finally in 1925, they formed the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And this was a big deal. They started trying to get better wages and stuff, and Pullman was doing their best to block it. And they finally hired a Philip Randolph. And this guy was brilliant. And they negotiated, they threatened strikes, they negotiated better hours and better pay. They went from 400 hours a month down to 240 hours a month, which considering the work, way back, the hours, some of the ridiculous hours they were working. And they got some overtime after 260 hours. things were better. They weren't ideal, but they were better. But what I found really interesting is that the step between labor rights to civil rights in the black community was a small step. And because the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters had learned how to organize, learned how to get people doing stuff, that they were able to take the lead in early civil rights efforts. And there was a guy in Montgomery, as they were dealing with the Montgomery bus strike, which Rosa Parks in that routine, there was a guy named E.D. Nixon who was influential in getting the bus strike going, but he was a Pullman porter. So he was gone for long periods of time, and he needed somebody who was there constantly. So he tapped a local minister new in town named Martin Luther King. Surprise. You know the rest of the story. In 1930, Pullman purchased the Standard Steel Car Company. They made freight cars, so they became Pullman Standard. That was their car building thing. There was an antitrust suit, started brewing in the late 30s. Another company wanted to build sleeping cars, but it was a monopoly. Pullman made the cars, Pullman ran the cars. So the trust suit dragged on for 4 years, and finally it was ruled against Pullman, and they had to break up the monopoly. And 3 more years it took to do that. But in 1947, they separated the manufacturing part of the company from the sleeping car operators. And 59 railroads bought the cars and then leased them back to Pullman to run them. So suddenly you get a name change. Instead of Pullman on the side, now you might see New York Central on the side and little Pullmans at the end, or Pullman and Union Pacific at the end. So you know they've switched off there. But things were going downhill. It was, the airplanes, the interstate highway system, passenger rail traffic was on a sharp decline, and with it, sleeping car traffic. And the Pullman sleeping car operations ceased in 1969. Of course, Amtrak took over 3 years later, so that changed that. And Pullman Standard built its last car in the early 80s. They built some, they built some superliners for Amtrak, and I think that may have been their last hurrah. The company's been broken up into little tiny bite-sized pieces. And this gives you the look of the end is near. You know, the paint's peeling off the roof. It's just an old, tired-looking car. And my parents took us down to visit relatives in North Carolina in 1967, I think. And we took a Pullman down. My parents knew I wouldn't be happy unless we did. I don't remember any of the details except I knew it was a Pullman. But it was probably getting to be an old, tired car. You know, I actually owned this car, or I put a price in, it was accepted on this car. 1980-ish. It was in White River Junction for a railroad museum that never got off the ground. I wanted to make it in my office, but I couldn't figure out where to put it. You know, what am I going to do with this thing? And Joe Miles would have said, "Not here, I'm busy." But so it went on to another fate. But the problem was it would have been fine for my office. It had no interior. It had been gutted out as a railroad work car. It was actually a Canadian National immigrant car. So it was, I think, an 18-section open, curtains, and never air conditioned. So it was kind of a throwback. And briefly, the legacy of Pullman. What's left? Company's gone. All the pieces are gone. I believe this is in like a interior shopping mall. You see the lettering in the back, and it's just on display. The town of Pullman is on the National Register. It's a very fancy neighborhood of Chicago. Nice place to live. The improvements that Pullman made, really making the sleeping car when my wife and I went out west, other than the fact it looks like Amtrak, that's what Pullman had developed worldwide. and the changes in labor and civil rights, a lot of that was Pullman. So the roots were in Pullman. Now, the original Orient Express, there was a Belgian came over to Chicago in the late 1860s, saw what Pullman was doing and said, I can do this in Europe. So he went back to Europe and organized basically Wagenlieds, the Wagenlieds. I don't speak French, so I could garble the complete name. But, and they were blue and cream. And they were Europe. Even the Pullman got into Italy for a little while, but basically they were Europe. But what's interesting is they've now redone the Orient Express, and they're using Pullman in the brown and cream. In England, there's still Pullman around. The name, it's not related to our Pullman, but it's the name Pullman is just, it's first class. And our friend Robin Harding was telling me there was the Brighton Express, which was a Pullman train. It was the last train from London to Brighton after the theaters closed. So it was full of theater folks. It never made any money, but their gin profits were amazing. They couldn't get rid of the train. And this is a new concoction, the Blue Pullman. You pay first class fare for your seat, and then you pay a Pullman fare on top of that to get quality service. Mercedes, see, the Pullman Guard. Mercedes has called their limousines Pullmans since the 1930s. Again, playing off the name. Pullman wasn't in Europe, but Mercedes took the name. I don't know if there was any money changing hands in there or something. But, the circus, so old equipment, new uses. Was, in their mid-20s, 9,800 cars. So where'd they go? Well, circuses took them. Circuses were always taken. Circuses were often overnight, and they needed someplace for their crews to sleep. So you had the show, you packed up the train, you put everybody on the train, everybody, and went to the next city. Railroads liked Pullman equipment. It was well made, heavy duty, and so they could adopt it for some use. Some sort of creative use here. They cut the end of the car down for who knows what. And there's an organization called the American Association of Private Rail Car Owners. And this is one of their trains. They were here in Manchester, last fall? They all get together. A lot of the cars are stored over in Rensselaer or anywhere in the country. And you see the last one is a lettered Pullman. And it's a mixed variety of cars. This story, this drives me nuts. We saw Georgia before, the Georgia Railroad business car. When President Obama went to his inauguration, you may remember he had a special train that went to Washington. And they did live coverage of it. Well, it went slow so he could see everybody. And the talking heads had to talk for hours about nothing. And they did. But with all the Amtrak cars, and of course the Amtrak guys in the engine house had done their job. The lead engine was 44, because Obama was president 44. Do you think anybody commented on that? These guys did their homework? No. The last car was the private business car, Georgia. They're going on for hours saying nothing. I'm going, aren't you going to say something about that? Have your lackeys look it up while we're talking. So finally Anderson Cooper comes on and goes, that last car, it's different. I've heard that last car in a train is a caboose, so I think that's a caboose. I've never believed a word he said since. If you don't have your own private car, but you want one, There's some for lease. This is Dover Harbor. It's based out of Washington, D.C. It's a 1930 Pullman. I think it has four double bedrooms, so it can take 8 people. It has a parlor section and a small kitchen. It's self-contained. So if you get 7 people together and decide to go to a wedding in Chicago or Mardi Gras, you hire Dover Harbor. And there you go. And it's not outrageous.
Sounds good.
And here we have Dover Harbor, October 2019. You might recognize that guy in the back and his daughter Charlotte. They were coming up to Chester to look at Vermont foliage and said, we need somebody to go along to kind of explain the history of the railroad we're going over. Me. You bet. And it's just, you're in the car, it's quiet, it's not a rattle trap, it's just, and the car is beautifully restored and has all Pullman fixtures, and I didn't clutter this show up with pictures of that's the car that I almost bought, ended up in Brattleboro, or in Bellows Falls, and I think I was trying to get Hildene to get it, because this is a sleeping car. This is the story that I think Hildene should tell, is the sleeping car. But it had no interior, so it would have been scrounging or rebuilding from scratch, and I think that was more than Seth wanted to take on. And then briefly on colors, and before I get into that, I'll mention names. Pullman cars were named, not numbered. And part of it was sort of to add this sort of, add to the experience, you know, you're sort of a dramatic name for your car. The other part, I think probably more important, is if you went on multiple railroads, what's the chance of you having the Pullman car having the same number as another car? And that would be confusing. So with names, there was no confusion. Railroad cars were numbered, Pullman cars were always named. And I don't know who had got to think up names, but there were a lot. I've got books like this, just on Pullman names.
Yeah.
After 1947, the railroads repainted the cars into their own color scheme. So here's a Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was always Tuscan red, even when they were part of, before Pullman was part of them, they were big enough railroad, biggest in the country, to say, we want our cars red, and Pullman said, okay. But you get a two-tone scheme. It was a New York Central scheme. The Union Pacific used some of it. You see yellow cars. They all went to railroad colors. And here you see the little Pullman here, Pullman there, Pullman, Pennsylvania. Before 1947, most Pullmans were Pullman green with gold. And this Dover Harbor, again, because most of the pictures I found were dirty. Dover Harbor was washed. That's a classic Pullman green. Originally, it was called Brewster green. Nobody knows where the color came from. Just about 1900, they started painting them green instead of the previous color. The previous color was brown and gold. And of course, black and white photography doesn't help me any here. So you can get with a model or a painting is the best I could do. But you see all the gilding. It probably was a hangover from the carriage building trade, where everything was mahogany and varnished. In fact, crack passenger trains, number of first-class trains, were always called varnish, even into the 60s. There wasn't any varnish on them, but they were called varnish. And it was a holdover from these days, and I think they were just using brown because natural wood on the outside of the car might have worked on a stagecoach, but not really well on a passenger car. So the brown, I think, represented mahogany, reflected what was inside. The Brits stayed with brown, and actually again, Robin chimed in, a Great Western Railway color. It was brown and white, and when they varnished the white, it came out cream, so brown and cream. But Pullman, the name Pullman Brown is still a real color, a copyright color. And there's a letter in that's supposedly at Hildene that I've never seen from a small startup company that said, we would like to use the brown and gold of Pullman to represent quality service, dependability, and may we do it? And apparently the answer was yes.
I'll be the upstream.
Thank you all. Any questions I can't answer? Kit?
I was wondering, when you travel on a train in Europe, you have these compartments with sliding doors, and the seats can be taken, put together so that people can sleep sideways in them, but they're in a private room.
And
Is there anything like that here?
yeah, that's the
Repeat the question back so people at home can.
The question was, in Europe, there are compartments with sliding doors, there's privacy, your beds are not in the aisle. You see the pictures from the movies in the 1930s where they're going down and they're the curtains, but those were open section cars. And as we got into the 40s and 50s, the demand for those dropped off. So that's when they went to rooms, roomettes, and if you go on Amtrak, that's all they are now. So yes, and it was all privacy. It was fine when it was better than sleeping in a coach, but the demand, they just followed public demand. Oh,
How did the financial arrangement work between the railroads and Pullman? How did the railroads make money hauling their hotel cars around?
there were two tiers, and you'd see it on the back of a timetable. You would pay a ticket fare, and the ticket went to the railroad. And then there was an extra supplementary charge that was for the Pullman, and that's what Pullman got. Now, whether there was any other arrangement in there, I'm not aware of, but it would always, on the back of a public timetable, you would see the Pullman fares in addition to the regular fare.
We have one question online. Are there any famous Pullman cars on display today other than Northeast Sunday?
Yes. There are a number, and again, I go back to what I say. Pullman, the Sunbeam is a beautiful restoration, but it's a private car. It wasn't. If you went to Manchester to get on the train, you wouldn't expect Sunbeam to come in and you get on. It's a whole different deal. The Conway Scenic has another, what did become a private car, but was once a regular general service car. A number of museums all over the country have Pullman cars in various configurations, and I can't rattle off where they are, but there's one in St. Louis, there's one in North Freedom, Wisconsin. But a lot of different railroads have them, and there's Dover Harbor. Dover Harbor is a beautifully restored working Pullman car that you can actually ride. And I believe there's some at Strasburg in Pennsylvania. But yes, there are a fair number of them around.
I remember I was down at Grand Central Station a few years ago, God, I don't know, and they had all these cars in there, for lobbyists and so forth. It was pretty exciting.
He was saying in Grand Central there were, a few years ago, Master Private Cars, it was probably the American Association of Railcar Owners, that they may have been ending or starting. When my wife and I were coming back from the West Coast, we were in the last car going out and coming back to Chicago. And when you change in Chicago, when we don't change stations, just change trains. When we went down to go on the platform, the first 4 cars on the back of the train were private rail cars. I knew immediately what they were and found a guy who owned them. But he didn't invite me in to ride. But it was a group that had hired these cars. There was a dining car, there was a dome car, and I think there were a couple of sleepers. And they had just made a big loop of the country and were just coming back. And as we pulled into Rensselaer Station, I looked out in the yard and there were a mess more of the other cars. And someone said, yeah, a lot of them are left, they store them here. So they're around.
Yeah, there was around.
And it's pretty interesting when you see them. And the nice thing about them on the back of our train, our car rode better because it wasn't the last car. And a funny aside story on that, my cousins were visiting their stepfather in Philadelphia. It must have been 1968 or 69. My cousins were about my age, but they were obviously a lot younger then. And their father was vice president of public relations for Penn Central. And he didn't want to put up with these two, early 20s kids. So he said, and they may have had room in their house in Philadelphia. He said, just stay in my private business car at Penn Station's 30th Street. So these two guys stayed, and there was a car attendant. So they got to stay in the car. So they went out, as all of us were wont to do at that era, hitting the bars and stuff, found two young ladies who agreed to come back to their house. And they're walking back through a non-residential area. And one of the girls said, where are we going? And they said, well, we're going to our private railroad car at Penn Station. They turned around, they were gone. Just, not these guys. They're really crazy.
I wanted to ask, I just was wondering if Pullman handled all the logistics when people had private cars and wanted to go from, I don't know, New York to Chicago. Would Pullman arrange for, Pennsylvania Railroad to carry them?
No, I think that was done directly with the railroad. Because Pullman didn't have their finger in that pie. They weren't supplying anything. I mean, I'm sure if you went to them and said, will you do it? They probably would have said, sure, pay us. But as far as I know, that was all done with the railroad. Because now it's done with Amtrak. You coordinate everything with Amtrak. And you have to meet Amtrak standards for safety equipment and the wheels and everything else all has to be modern. You can't take an old wooden car out and tell Amtrak to pull it. They're going to go, no, not a chance.
Last June, the first trip since the pandemic, we went on Via Rail Canada from Toronto to Vancouver. And 6 years ago, Via Rail Canada, they added another first-class sleeper. It's called the Prestige class. And on every train from Vancouver to Toronto, Toronto to Vancouver, what it is, it's the largest bedroom that they have, and their own private bathroom, their own private shower, and a big window. And they also have the last car on the Via Rail Transcontinental, train number 1 and train number 2. It's called the Park, P-A-R-K car. It's a lounge car, and there's 2 private bedrooms there also. But what they also have on Via Rail Canada, when I was young, I went to summer camp in Canada. When I was 14 years old, it was the Canadian National and the Canadian Pacific before it became Via Rail Canada. And they had what was called a section. You showed that there. During the day, there's 2 little seats, and at night there's a curtain, and there's a bunk bed and a lower berth.
Yep.
And they close the curtain at night.
Yep.
They still have that on Via Rail Canada.
Oh, do they?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I took the train, it was Via then, but it was on the Canadian Pacific route through Banff and Lake Louise and spiral tunnels, the late 70s, I think. And they had both a dome car and a round end observation car with a dome on it. And I don't think they had an extra fare sleeper. I was just by myself. I just needed a basic sleeping car.
Yeah, we took that one.
Don't forget to tell them about the trains.
Oh, before anyone leaves, I did bring a few models in if anyone wants to take a look.
Frank's out of here.
On the train between Washington and Montreal before Amtrak, there were 5 different railroads handled that car between Washington and Montreal. How did they divide up the revenue?
I have no idea. Probably by mileage. I would assume. How many miles on each railroad would be my guess. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.